Um, quiet. So today we're doing the quadratic formula and the discriminant. The quadratic formula can be used to find solutions to any quadratic equation. If there is a solution, the quadratic formula will give it to you every time, no matter what. It will work when nothing else will work. Okay. I don't like to use it a whole lot, okay, because it is complicated. There's no getting around that. It is complicated. If you can factor or use square roots, factoring or using square roots is a much, much, much better way of solving than using the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula works every time, but the quadratic formula is the last resort. And this is why. This is the quadratic formula. I'm going to write it up on the board over here as well.
So it works with any single problem?
Right, so if I have a quadratic equation with ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0, it must be equal to 0. The quadratic formula, x equals minus b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all divided by 2 times a.
Why is this so hard?
Because that's what it is sometimes. Okay, now, it will work every time. There are a few things that you need to be careful of. And you will notice when I do it, I never take shortcuts. The first time, my first step is to just write the numbers in the formula. I do not do any simplifying until I've written everything down. Most mistakes come from students trying to simplify things in their head before they write it down. Okay, I've given the test with the formula literally on the test. And kids will screw it up because they do exactly what I tell them not to do. They try to do it in their head before writing it down. If you write it down, you're less likely to make a mistake. And it's not that hard if you write it down. Now, the first step in using the quadratic formula is identifying the A, the B, and the C of any equation. This is the first step. You have to be able to do that. Okay, the A is how many x squareds I have. So in this example here, what's my A? 4, because I have 4x squared, so my A is 4. How many B's do I have? What's my B? Yes, watch the negatives. It's how many x's? I have a negative 6. And then C is just the constant by itself. My C is 7. So when I use the formula, all I will do is take these three numbers and plug them into the appropriate places in the formula. We'll be doing that in a minute. Okay, we'll do a couple of problems together. You'll see exactly how to do this. Okay. Now, the cool thing, or I should say one of the cool things about the quadratic formula is the discriminant, which is part of the quadratic formula. Okay. Part of the quadratic formula is called the discriminant. Specifically, it's the part that's underneath the square root. That will tell me not my answers, but will tell me how many of what kind of answers I have. So you can tell whether or not you're actually going to have an answer to a problem before you figure out the answer to the problem. That's what the discriminant does. Okay. So the discriminant tells you how many answers, how many solutions you have of what kind without actually solving the problem. Okay? I know, I'm going to pause. Now, if the discriminant, like I said, let me get this out of the way here. just the part that's underneath. The discriminant is just this part here. If that number is positive, your graph will look something like that, either pointing up or pointing down. It will cross twice, and you have two real solutions. You have two real answers. Okay. If the discriminant is negative, what that means is the graph never actually, the parabola does not cross the x-axis, and you have no solutions. You can't take the square root of a negative number. If the discriminant's negative, that means the number underneath the square root is negative. You have no answers because you cannot take the square root of a negative number. And if the discriminant is 0, excuse me, the graph touches in one place, and you have one real solution, the place it touches. The discriminant is 0 when you have a perfect square. And if your original problem was a perfect square, your discriminant will be 0. Okay? Questions before you... People are still writing on Google. All right. Using the quadratic formula, what is the solution? So I'm going to walk you through this, setting it up step by step. You have the quadratic formula on the other side of your notes. I have the quadratic formula up on the board. And you can use these notes when you take the test. So first thing you have to do is you have to identify your A, your B, and your C. You have to know what those numbers are first. So A, how many x squared do I have?
1.
I have 1, so my A is 1. That's nice. Okay. My B, how many x's do I have? I have negative 2 x's, because whenever you have x's, it's always a negative. I have negative 2 x's. And then what's my C? Negative 8. You have to do this. Watch your negatives and positives when you do this. Okay. First step, identify A, B, and C. Second step, plug A, B, and C into the quadratic formula. Don't change anything, strictly plug the numbers in. So, x equals minus b, so it's minus negative 2. Notice, I put minus negative 2. It's minus b. I don't change it to plus 2. I don't do that till after I've written everything down. Okay. Plus or minus the square root of b squared, so negative 2 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is negative 8. That negative 8 is important. The negative with the 8 is important in this problem. All divided by 2 times a. First step, just plug the numbers in. Don't do anything before that first step other than plug numbers in. First mistake students make is trying to do things in their head and simplify things first. Write it down. Whenever you have a formula for anything, just put the numbers in. Don't try to simplify until you've got it written down. And then simplify. Okay, do it step by step. So I have minus negative 2, which is actually positive 2. So it equals 2 plus or minus the square root of, I take negative 2 and square it to get 4. And then I have minus 4 times negative 8. Well, I have a negative times a negative, which means I have a plus. And 4 times 8 is 32. Bless you. And then 2 times 1 is 2. I didn't do a lot, did I? I took care of a double negative. I squared b. I multiplied 4 and A and C and got the correct sign. And then I took the 2 times A on the bottom and multiplied it. Don't do too much at once. It's another thing that students try to do is too much at once. Take the time. You got the paper. Write it down. Okay. Equals 2 plus or minus the square root. What's 4 plus 32? 36. All divided by 2. I cannot divide by 2 unless everything is divisible by 2. And although 36 is divisible by 2, 36 is still inside the square root. Now, depending upon the problem, you can stop right here. The question is my square root a perfect square root? Can I take the square root of 36 without pulling out a calculator? Yeah, what's the square root of 36? 6, right? So that means I have 2 plus or minus 6 over 2. Because the square root of 36 is 6. If you can't take the square root, leave it. This one I can, so I'm going to simplify it more. Okay. Now I can simplify and keep going on this one too. I have 2 answers, right? I have 2 plus 6 divided by 2. 2 plus 6, that's 8 divided by 2. And I have 2 minus 6, which is negative 4, divided by 2. I do 2 plus 6, I do 2 minus 6, because it's 2 plus or minus 6. Okay, are you with me? Do you see that? 2 plus, 2 minus, my 2 answers. 8 divided by 2 is 4. Negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2. These are my answers. And I'm going to tell you, you get down to here and there's no square roots, it means the problem was factorable to begin with. Right? So that was a factorable one. Factoring it would be a better way to solve it than doing all of this, right? But this will work every time. Now, be warned on the test. If I tell you to solve by factoring and you use the quadratic formula, you won't get any points. There are a couple of tests and only a couple of tests, and this is being recorded, so it's there for everybody to hear. There are only a couple of tests where I ask you to do something using a specific method. If I ask you to do it a specific way, you must do it using that method. And if you don't, you get a 0, even if you get the correct answers. Because it's not just about the answers, it's how can you get there. And if there's more than one way, you need to show me you can do it more than one way. Okay? It's one of the few times I actually do that. Usually it's just give me the answer and I'm done. This is one of the few times where if I say solve by factoring, you need to factor. If I solve by completing the square, you need to use completing the square. If I say solve using the quadratic formula, you need to use the quadratic formula. Okay, it's one of the few times I do that. Okay, problem number 2. What are the solutions? I have a problem, yes.
A is 3x.
Yes, but we have somewhere to go before we get to there. I have a problem though. In order to use the quadratic formula, it needs to be equal to 0. Is that one equal to 0? No, so my first step is actually subtract 7 from both sides. So I get negative 3x squared plus 5x minus 7 is equal to 0. If it's not equal to 0, I can't use a quadratic formula. It won't work. It's like solving by factoring. It has to be equal to 0 or it won't work. Okay. Now, take a second, identify the A, B, and C. Put it on your papers. So this one, your A is -3, your B is 5, and your C is -7. A is how many x squareds I have. I have -3x squared. B is how many x's. I've got 5 x's. C is -7 because that's the constant on its own. Okay. Plug them into the formula, write it down on your paper. Okay. Plug the A, B, and C into the formula. Just plug it in. Don't do any simplifying. Plug it in. Write it down. I don't know. We'll find out in a minute. I don't know. I haven't worked it out. All right. So, first step, like I said, write down the A, B, and C. So you have, or write down the formula. X equals minus B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C, all divided by 2 times A. So that should be your first step, just writing it all down. Okay. Go ahead and start simplifying it. It should be, so it's -5, because it's minus B, -5 plus or minus the square root of 5 squared. 5 looks like crap, get over it. Minus 4 times A, which is -3, times C, which is -7, all divided by 2 times A, which is -3. So X equals, and then you start to simplify. Can't do anything with the -5, so I just -5 plus or minus 5 squared is 25. 4 times 3 is 12. 12 times 7 is 84. And I have 1, 2, 3 negatives, so that's minus 84. All over 2 times -3, that's -6. Okay. Combine up what's underneath the square root. X equals -5 plus or minus the square root of -59 all over -6. And I cannot take the square root of -59. 1, 59, that's not a perfect square. 2, you cannot take the square root of a negative number. So because of this negative, there's no solution. However, on the test, if this were a problem, you would need to work it out here before you told me there was no solution. Yeah. If that was positive, you would just leave it like it is and you're done. You cannot take the square root of whatever that number is, you're done. And it'll be that. You might have a problem. I'm not saying you do exactly have this. You might have a problem where you get down to X equals -3 plus or minus the square root of 21 over 2, and that's it, you're done because you can't take the square root of 21. So that would be your final answer. That's okay. All right? You can get to here. If you get to here, can't simplify the square root, you're finished. You're done. That would be your answer. No, that's not the answer to the problem. I'm just saying that's a possible what it might look like. You might have something that looks like this at some point. That's okay. All right? Now, choosing a method to solve each quadratic. We've actually covered 4 ways of solving quadratics. 1, square roots. Solving by getting square roots. If you have just an x squared, you get the x squared by itself, take the square root of both sides. Second way, factoring. Third way, completing the square. And then the one we just learned today, the quadratic formula. Formula, not formulae. Because I'm sure you all go yay when you use it, right? Formulae. Yeah, okay. So, any one of those methods could be used to solve a quadratic depending upon the quadratic. There's only one way that's guaranteed to work every time. The quadratic formula. Factoring is my favorite method. It is the least work required. Okay. So here's what I want you to do. Take a minute, look at each one, decide which method you would use to solve each problem. See if you can decide, and there are not necessarily wrong answers, but there are some that are better answers than others. Take a minute. 5 problems. You do not have to solve the problems. Which method do you think would be the best way of solving each one of those problems? Okay? Okay, so on these problems, realistically, there aren't any really wrong answers. On the first one, I would do square roots because you have x squared and no other x's, just x squared. I would use square roots on this one. On the next one, it is factorable, so I would use factoring on this one. On the next one, C, as near as I can tell on C, it's not factorable. So on C, I would use the quadratic formula. If I look at D, D is not factorable. There are no two numbers to multiply to give me 3 that add to give me 5. So I would use the quadratic formula. And then E is just nasty. Formula, not formulae. Formula. Although I want to say yay when I use it. It's okay. The next one's nasty. I would try factoring first, but factoring is not going to be easy with this one. So this would also probably be a quadratic formula. Although, to be honest, the quadratic formula is going to be nasty looking too because of the big numbers you're squaring and multiplying. Okay. Now, notice there was one I never used on any of them. Completing the square. I hate completing the square for solving quadratics. I wouldn't use it unless I was told I had to use it. What? Factoring is the. Okay. Questions?